Many people have wanted Dovetail Games to bring Northeast Corridor New York over to Train Sim World 2 for a very long time now. If you watched my previous video, I am highly against this idea solely due to the relatively poor route choice. I think the route should just be left in the past and be forgotten for good. However, what if Dovetail did another attempt at a Northeast Corridor route in New York? What should they do differently? I think the best solution is to take on the section between New York and Philadelphia. This is one of the lesser talked about sections of the Northeast Corridor, but it is my personal favorite part of the entire route. Many may remember this from Train Simulator Classic. It was Dovetail Games' first ever attempt at making a Northeast Corridor route. Unfortunately, it had lots of inaccuracies, a lot of missing rolling stock, and was just an overall poor representation of the Northeast Corridor. But from then and now, I think Dovetail has the capabilities of serving this route the justice it deserves. New York to Philadelphia has the potential of being one of the best US passenger routes and one of the busiest in Train Sim World. We will be talking about this section of the Northeast Corridor in today's video. Before we get into it, I do not own any footage within this video. All rights go to their respective owners, and all footage within this video will be linked in the description. With that out of the way, let's get right into the video. For those that are unfamiliar to this route, the Northeast Corridor is an intercity passenger line traveling between the American capital Washington, D.C. and Boston, Massachusetts. The line is mostly owned and operated by Amtrak, spanning over 457 miles and a total of 108 stations. Amtrak stops at only 30 of these 108 stops. It is America's only high-speed line, having a top speed of 150 miles an hour. It is one of the busiest passenger corridors in the United States, seeing over 2,200 daily trains. In 2019, it had an annual ridership of over 12 million riders. The corridor is used by various Amtrak trains ranging from intercity trains to long-distance trains to high-speed trains. Many commuter operators also run on various portions of the Northeast Corridor. These include MBTA, MARC, New Jersey Transit, SEPTA, CT Rail, and Metro North. The entire corridor is fully implemented with ACSCS, or Advanced Civil Speed Enforcement System. This safety system enforces all speed limits along the route to prevent derailments. It can also be used to enforce temporary speed limits in the event of track work needing to take place. The line serves various cities along the Northeast, including the American capital Washington, D.C., Baltimore, Wilmington, Philadelphia, New York City, New Haven, New London, Providence, and Boston. It is a vital passenger line that thousands use for various commuting purposes every single day. For the sake of this video, I will be talking about the section traveling between New York City and Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. This section of the corridor travels for approximately 91 miles and has a total of 28 stations. The top speed of this part of the Northeast Corridor is 135 miles an hour, which can be seen on the 24-mile stretch of track between New Brunswick and Hamilton. Now let me stop myself right there for a moment. Literally just a few days after I recorded this video, on Saturday, May 28th, 2022, Amtrak completed upgrades on this 24-mile stretch of track to allow trains to be able to reach 150 miles an hour. So every time I say that this is the second fastest portion of the Northeast Corridor, please disregard it, as now this is the fastest part. Now, how does this route differ from Boston to Providence? There are a lot of differences between these two parts of the corridor. In terms of scenery, New York to Philadelphia travels through a lot more urban areas than Boston Sprinter. However, there is still a fair share of suburban and open land along the route. The route is also more relatively flat. Most of the notable scenery on this route is seen within the dense areas such as New York, New Brunswick, and Philadelphia. New York to Philadelphia is one of the busiest portions of the entire Northeast Corridor, seeing hundreds of daily trains. Due to the high amounts of traffic seen on this route, the entire line is quadruple tracked to handle all these trains. The outermost tracks are used by commuter trains making frequent stops, while the center tracks are for high-speed intercities and limited-stop commuter trains. The line sees intercity, long-distance, and high-speed trains performed by Amtrak, and commuter trains performed by New Jersey Transit and SEPTA. Let's go into more detail on all these operators and what they have to offer on this route. Starting with Amtrak, the operator runs various of its services along the Northeast Corridor. Amtrak operates its Northeast Regional, Keystone, Palmetto, Cardinal, Vermonter, Carolinian, Crescent, Pennsylvanian, Silver Star, Silver Meteor, and Acela Express on the Northeast Corridor. Most of these services only run daily, except the Northeast Regional, Keystone, and Acela Express. Stopping patterns vary based on each service, with some making more or less stops than others. Services such as the Northeast Regional, Keystone, and Acela Express also have their own varied stopping patterns. Amtrak trains will be serving New York Penn, Newark International Airport, Metro Park, New Brunswick, Princeton Junction, Trenton, Cornwallis Heights, North Philadelphia, and Philadelphia 30th Street Station. All Amtrak services excluding the Acela are hauled by the ACS-64. The ACS-64 is a dual-cab electric locomotive built by Siemens Mobility between 2012 and 2016 for use on the Northeast Corridor and the Keystone Corridor. Its design was based off of the well-known Siemens Vectrons used in Europe. The locomotive has a maximum power output of 8,600 horsepower and a maximum service speed of 125 miles an hour. Since the ACS-64 came from Northeast Corridor Boston to Providence, Dovetail can most certainly reuse this train on this route. Something I would like to see Dovetail Games add to the ACS-64 for this route is Veterans Unit 642. In addition, it would also be cool to see some services that are double headers, as these do occur relatively often on longer trains. The ACS-64 uses a raised letter K5LA and an E-bell. Although the sounds in TSW are accurate to the real-life counterpart, I think the horn could use some minor improvements. Amtrak uses a wide variety of rolling stock on the Northeast Corridor. These include Amfleet 1s, which can be reused from Boston Sprinter, Amfleet 2s, ranging from standard coaches, cafe cars, and business cafe hybrids, and Viewliners, ranging from sleepers, diners, and baggage cars. Amfleet 2s are relatively similar to Amfleet 1s. The most notable differences between these Amfleets is that the Amfleet 2s only have one vestibule, increased legroom, larger windows, and folding leg rests. These are used exclusively on Amtrak's long-distance services. Viewliners are sleeper cars used by long-distance trains east of Chicago. Just like the Amfleets, there are also two variants. Viewliner 2s are updated versions of the Viewliner 1s, having an improved interior and various other small changes. They are also painted in Amtrak's Phase 3 livery. Keystone services exclusively use an ex-Metroliner cab car on the rear of all trains. However, on rare occasions, an ACS-64 can be seen on both ends of a Keystone train. These cab cars were formerly electric multiple units called Metroliners. They were manufactured by the Budd Rail Company for high-speed use on the Northeast Corridor. They were certified for speeds of up to 150 miles an hour, but due to track conditions and electrical issues, they were only able to go between 100 and 125 miles an hour. They were extremely unreliable, ultimately leading to all of them being retired, and 29 of them being converted into cab cars for a few different services back in the late 1980s and 90s. Modern day, they are used on only 3 Amtrak services, including Hartford Line services, the Valley Flyer, and Keystone services. Many may remember this cab car from the SW1000R DLC that was released for Northeast Corridor New York. This route would be a perfect opportunity to reintroduce the Keystone cab car back in the train sim world. The ex-Metroliner cab car uses a Nathan K5LA in an old gen steel bell. New York to Philadelphia would be a perfect route to introduce the Acela Express on, since New Brunswick to Hamilton is the second fastest portion of the entire Northeast Corridor. The Acela Express is an electric train set built by Alstom and Bombardier between 1998 and 2001. 20 train sets were built for Amtrak and entered service back in 2000. It has a maximum power output of 6,200 horsepower and a top speed of 150 miles an hour. Train sets are formed of 2 power cars and 6 coaches. It is the only tilting train within the United States. The Acela uses a hybrid K5LA and uses a steel bell or an E-bell. If Dovetail ever adds the Acela to Boston to Providence, they could most certainly layer it onto this route. It could also be included as part of the base route and be layered onto Boston Sprinter. Unfortunately, the Acela will be slowly going out of service within the coming years to be replaced by the Avelia Liberty, but we don't talk about that thing. I would much prefer seeing the original Acela on this route, and it is easily one of the most iconic trains on the Northeast Corridor today. Many Amtrak services begin and terminate at New York Penn, meaning they get to interact with Sunnyside Yard. Trains will travel to Sunnyside Yard and be put away for storage and maintenance. The yard is also where some trains can change directions via a 180-degree turnaround that goes underneath the main line. There are also many possibilities for services that can be performed by switchers. On NEC New York, Dovetail included an SW1000R DLC. However, I think this wouldn't be a good route to reintroduce it on, as the more common switcher used in Sunnyside Yard modern day is the MPI GP15D. The locomotive is a 4-axle, diesel-electric road switcher built by EMD and MPI between 2000 and 2004. It has a maximum power output of 1,500 horsepower and a top speed of 70 miles an hour. Amtrak purchased 10 of these units. In the original DLC for NEC New York, the SW1000R only had 4 services, these being services where it had to build consists for a Northeast Regional, an Empire service, a Maple Leaf, and a Carolinian. I think the GP15D could have a lot more services if Dovetail Games plans to add a switcher for Sunnyside Yard. There will most likely be additional services where you have to build other consists for Amtrak services that originate in New York. There can also be services for disassembling particular trains. Dovetail could also include a series of services where you have to rescue a failed train at New York Penn. Similar to the MP15DC from Peninsula Corridor, the GP15D also can perform ballast moves where trains run with grain hoppers carrying ballast along the route and distributing it to various locations. Personally, I don't know how many services this could have, but it could range from as little as 15 services to up to 40 services. It solely depends on how many trains the GP15D would be able to assemble and disassemble. I was unable to find out if Sunnyside Yard still uses SW1000Rs modern day, but all I was able to find is that lots of them have been retired and some have been rebuilt. This makes the GP15D the best option for a switcher on this route. In terms of the ex-Metroliner cab car, its service count would be relatively similar, having 13 mainline services. It is likely that there may be a few additional services that go from Sunnyside Yard to New York Penn. Now, in terms of the total service count for Amtrak, New York to Philadelphia is easily the busiest section when it comes to Amtrak traffic. On Boston to Providence, there were only 16 Northeast Regional services. Amtrak runs a lot more Northeast Regional services south of New York. Outside of COVID times, Amtrak operates 74 Northeast Regional services, 26 Keystone services, 20 Acela services, and 18 other Amtrak services, adding up to 138 mainline Amtrak services running on the route. A lot more ideal than the only 25 Amtrak services on Boston Sprinter. Now, if we put into consideration depot runs and switching services done by the GP15, I could see between 175 to 220 total Amtrak services on this route. Since Amtrak only stops at 10 of the 28 stations, this is where New Jersey Transit and SEPTA entered the fray. New Jersey Transit is a commuter rail operator that serves the New York metropolitan area and various counties within New Jersey. The operator runs a total of 11 lines and 164 stations. It is the second busiest commuter operator within the nation. New Jersey Transit runs its Northeast Corridor and North Jersey coastlines on New York to Philadelphia. The Northeast Corridor line travels between New York Penn Station and Trenton Transit Center, traveling approximately 58 miles and making a total of 17 stops. The North Jersey coastline runs along the Northeast Corridor between New York Penn or Hoboken Terminal to Rahway, traveling approximately 23 miles and stopping at a total of 8 stations. Trains then branch off to the left and travel down to Long Branch and Bayhead. The Northeast Corridor line is the busiest New Jersey Transit line, seeing hundreds of trains every day. There is a mass variety in service types that run on this route. Trains will be doing services between New York Penn and Trenton, or New York Penn to Jersey Avenue. New Jersey Transit runs a mix of local, limited stop, and express trains on the Northeast Corridor line, similar to Peninsula Corridor. Trains will be able to run up to 100 miles an hour on this route, making it one of the fastest commuter rail lines in the United States. There is also a small 3-mile branch that travels between Princeton Junction and Princeton University. This small line is served by what is known as the Dinky Shuttle, providing consistent service between the two stations. In terms of the North Jersey coastline, New Jersey Transit primarily runs local trains with a couple limited stop and express trains. However, most express trains do not stop at Rahway, meaning some services would have to end at Newark Penn. The line would have to be extended to Woodbridge to allow for longer express services. However, it would make more sense for Dovetail to one day just make the North Jersey coastline as its own route later down the road. In terms of the locomotive fleet, New Jersey Transit uses the Aero 3, ALP-45DP, ALP-45A, ALP-46, and ALP-46A, pulling Bombardier multi-level 1 and 2 coaches, Comet 2 and Comet 4 coaches, and Comet 5 cab cars. Starting with the most common locomotives seen on this route, the ALP-46 is a dual-cab electric locomotive used on all of New Jersey Transit's electrified lines. The locomotive was built by Bombardier between 1999 and 2001. Its design was based off of the well-known DBBR-101 that is seen in Trains in World 2. The locomotive has a maximum power output of 7,100 horsepower and a top speed of 100 miles an hour. Unlike most modern US locomotives, the ALP-46 uses Westinghouse braking similar to the F40PH-2 Chatham Peninsula Corridor. Between 2009 and 2011, New Jersey Transit received upgraded versions of the ALP-46 known as the ALP-46A. The locomotive has an increased power output of 7,500 horsepower and a raised top speed of 125 miles an hour. The operator received 36 of these units. On New Jersey Transit's 40-year anniversary celebration in 2019, they repainted ALP-46A 4936 into a Pennsylvania Railroad paint scheme. In terms of sounds, the ALP-46 and 46A are slightly different. The most notable difference between the two are the traction motors. On the standard ALP-46, the traction motors make a single whine while accelerating. And on the ALP-46A, 3 different whines occur on the traction motors, similar to Railpool's DBBR-187s. Most ALP-46s use an E-bell, while some standard ALP-46s use a steel bell. Both trains use a fouled Nathan K5LA or raised letter K5LA. The ALP-45DP is a dual-powered locomotive built by Bombardier between 2010 and 2012. Unlike the ALP-46, the ALP-45DP is only a single cab and has a slightly different appearance from the ALP-46. New Jersey Transit received 35 of these units. The locomotive has a maximum power output of 5,900 horsepower in electric mode and 2,734 horsepower in diesel mode when head-end powered is enabled. In electric mode, the ALP-45 is capable of speeds of 125 miles an hour and 100 miles an hour in diesel mode. Just like the ALP-46, the locomotive uses Westinghouse braking. ALP-45DP 4519 also has a Heritage Erie-Lackawanna Railroad livery. Similarly, New Jersey Transit ordered upgraded versions of these locomotives between 2017 and 2020 labeled as the ALP-45A. These units have just recently begun operations, entering revenue service on July 30th, 2021. These units are still being delivered, so they are still relatively uncommon. The most notable cosmetic differences on the 45A is that it has LED headlights. I was unable to find out how much horsepower the ALP-45 has, but I would assume it is higher than the standard ALP-45. The loco has the same top speed as the standard ALP-45DP. Similar to the ALP-46, the ALP-45 uses a fouled Nathan K5LA or raised letter K5LA and uses an E-bell. Next up, the Aero 3 is an electric multiple unit built by General Electric between 1977 and 1978. New Jersey Transit owns 200 cars formed as married pairs and 30 single cars. It has a maximum power output of 1,125 horsepower for each married pair, and 750 horsepower for each single pair. It has a top speed of 80 miles an hour after a rebuilding of all coaches between 1992 and 1995. The Aero 3 uses a Westinghouse AA2 horn and does not have a bell. These emus are what is used on the Dinky Shuttle. However, these trains have become a lot less common on the Northeast Corridor, only really being seen during peak hours. In 2018, New Jersey Transit ordered 113 electric multiple unit coaches that will be built by Bombardier to replace the Aero 3s. However, they will not be entering service anytime soon. Moving on to the rolling stock, New Jersey Transit operates a mix of single-level and multi-level coaches, but most predominantly multi-level coaches. New Jersey Transit's multi-level coaches were constructed by Bombardier. They purchased approximately 430 passenger coaches and cab cars between 2006 and 2009 and between 2012 and 2013. These passenger coaches are relatively common along the Northeast Corridor, also being seen on MARC. These coaches have 4 sets of doors, 2 for high-level platform boarding and 2 for low-level boarding. In terms of sounds, these multi-levels use the raised letter Nathan K5LA and an E-bell. For single-level trains, New Jersey Transit uses a mix of Comet 2 and Comet 4 coaches. For cab car use, they use the Comet 5. The Comet 2s were manufactured by Bombardier between 1982 and 1983. New Jersey Transit purchased 142 coaches and 19 cab cars. These coaches allowed for improved boarding at low-level platforms. All these coaches were rebuilt between 1999 and 2003 by AAI and Alstom to make them similar to the Comet 4 coaches. The Comet 4s were also built by Bombardier. New Jersey Transit received 78 coaches and 21 cab cars in 1996. These coaches are relatively similar to the Comet 3 coaches. However, there was no trapdoor by the engineer's cab. They were eventually deactivated once the Comet 5 coaches entered service in 2002. The Comet 5 was manufactured by Alstom. New Jersey Transit received 116 coaches and 84 cab cars. However, no Comet 5 coaches are used on the Northeast Corridor due to a lack of funding for additional passenger coaches. These are the newest in the single-level fleet. Unlike the previous generations of the Comet coaches, the Comet 5 has a stainless steel frame. The Comet 5 cab car uses a Nathan K5LA and a steel bell. Something I would like to see for New Jersey Transit trains on this route are occasional double-headed trains. New Jersey Transit does this relatively often on their longer trains. Even if we were able to just get a few services using a double-headed consist, that would be really awesome to see. Although diesel trains do not operate revenue service anymore on the Northeast Corridor, New Jersey Transit occasionally does equipment moves to move equipment to Sunnyside Yard and Morrisville Yard. These equipment moves are performed by the EMD GP40PH-2. These moves can be really interesting as they can be seen carrying various types of equipment ranging from passenger coaches, Aero 3s, and other electric locomotives. These equipment moves can range from simple 2-car long consists to between 10 to 15 cars and locomotives in length. This would make for some really interesting gameplay as it is something you can't really see anywhere else in the nation. The only issue, however, is that it's likely that there are very few services for this to be a viable DLC option. I think if Dovetail Games wanted to make this possible, they should make a diesel New Jersey Transit route that has the GP40 on it and then layer it onto this route. Now Dovetail could get away with having an ALP46 doing an equipment move, although it's not highly realistic. In total, there will be up to 295 passenger services for New Jersey Transit. These include 133 Northeast Corridor Line services, 78 North Jersey Coastline services, and 84 Dinky services. New Jersey Transit has a few different storage facilities along the Northeast Corridor. At the northern end of the route, New Jersey Transit trains interact with Sunnyside Yard. There is also a small storage facility within New York Penn. At Trenton, New Jersey Transit trains will interact with Morrisville Yard. This is a depot for trains beginning and ending service on the Northeast Corridor where trains can be stored for later use. With all these depots and the possibilities of maintenance moves and deadheads, I could see up to 350 to 375 New Jersey Transit services. New Jersey Transit most definitely is the primary traffic seen on this route, which is why it is important that Dovetail includes the operator. New Jersey Transit has been requested numerous times by the Train Sim World community, and I think this is the best route to introduce the operator on. SEPTA is a commuter rail operator owned by the Southeastern Philadelphia Transportation Authority serving the Philadelphia metropolitan area. SEPTA operates a total of 13 lines and 154 stations serving the surrounding suburbs of Philadelphia and Trenton, spanning over 280 miles of track. It is the 5th busiest commuter railroad in the country, having an annual ridership of 3.2 million riders in 2015. It is also the busiest commuter operator outside of New York and Chicago. On the Northeast Corridor, SEPTA operates its Trenton line traveling between Temple University and Trenton Transit Center. I personally think Dovetail Games should include Temple University since it is only 3 miles past 30th Street Station, providing the entire Trenton line. The line travels for approximately 36 miles and stops at 15 stations. Most services stop at all stations along the route. About half of them, however, skip Eddington. There are also 4 limited stop trains. 2 travel during the morning rush hour towards Philadelphia, and 2 in the evening rush hour towards Trenton. These limited stop services skip Eddington, Tacony, Bridesburg, in North Philadelphia. SEPTA uses a couple different trains on the Trenton line. Limited stop services exclusively use an ACS 64 with 6 Comet 2 passenger coaches. The Comet 2s and cab car were manufactured by Bombardier in 1999. The cab car uses a Nathan K5LA and a steel bell. SEPTA is the only other operator to purchase the ACS 64, getting around 15 units in 2018. For standard commuter services, SEPTA uses the Silverliner 4 and Silverliner 5. Similar to the Aero 3 on New Jersey Transit, the Silverliner 4 is an electric multiple unit built by General Electric between 1973 and 1976. 232 single and married pairs were built for SEPTA. Each car has a power output of 550 horsepower and a top speed of 100 miles an hour. The Silverliner 4 uses an S2M horn, and just like the Aero 3, it does not have a bell. Although it has a relatively similar appearance to the Aero 3, the Silverliner 4s are not a simple reskin. Aero 3s have a door in the middle while the Silverliner 4s do not. This means that the interior for each train would be very different. SEPTA trains would also have additional ventilation on the roof. Moving on, the Silverliner 5 is an electric multiple unit built by Hyundai Rona between 2009 and 2016. These EMUs are the newest trains within the SEPTA fleet, replacing 73 Silverliner 2s and Silverliner 3s. SEPTA purchased 120 of these units. I was unable to find out how much horsepower it has, but I would assume it's higher than the Silverliner 4's horsepower at 550. It has a top speed of 110 miles an hour. The Silverliner 5 uses a Nathan K3LA and does not have a bell just like the other SEPTA EMUs. SEPTA trains will be interacting with Powelton Yard, located right next to Philadelphia 30th Street Station. This is where SEPTA trains will go to be serviced and stored. This could add a lot of services since various SEPTA lines use this depot. Before COVID times, SEPTA operated 48 trains on the Trenton line. Adding depot moves and deadheads, I could see around 70 to 90 services for SEPTA trains on this route. Although nowhere is the same level as New Jersey Transit, SEPTA would add a lot of variety to this route as the operations for SEPTA trains are a lot different than New Jersey Transit trains. SEPTA is yet another highly requested operator to come to Train Sim World 2, and this would be a great route to introduce it on. There's not a significant amount of freight that travels on this route. Major freight trains haven't operated on the route since the early 1980s. Most freight traffic on this route are primarily locals. There are various facilities and small yards that local trains can interact with along the route. They usually operate during off-peak hours, meaning some may be operating at nighttime. I don't know how many services there could be as there are a couple different local trains that run on this route. I would say there would roughly be 10 to 20 services. This would be a good opportunity to bring back the EMD GP40 from Northeast Corridor New York onto this route. Even if these services are still not playable and Dovetail Games just uses a GP38 like they did on Boston Sprinter, it would still add quite a bit of flavor to the route and make it feel a lot more alive. It was really difficult to think of what makes the most sense to add to this route as part of the base pack. Each train on this route plays a role in some way. Dovetail Games would most definitely add the ACS 64 to this route since it is the bulk of the main traffic in terms of Amtrak, and they also made it for Boston Sprinter. In addition, Dovetail Games could modify it to make it fit the SEPTA version. When it comes to the common coaches used by SEPTA on their local haul trains, they are relatively similar to the Comet 2 coaches used by New Jersey Transit. Dovetail Games would have to include the Arrow 3 on this route if they want to include the Dinky Shuttle. The Silverliner 4s are also relatively similar to the Arrow 3s, although they do have their differences. The Acela would allow for additional variety for Amtrak on the route, and it would make a lot of sense to add to this route since it is the second fastest portion of the entire Northeast Corridor. However, the 3 locos Dovetail Games needs to include on this route are the ACS 64, the ALP 46, and the ALP 46A with multi-level coaches. The ACS 64 would also come with the Amfleet 2s and Viewliners since Dovetail Games has already made the Amfleet 1s for TSW. As mentioned before, the Acela could be a DLC for Boston Sprinter and get layered onto this route or vice versa. When it comes to the EMUs that run on this route, Dovetail Games would be better off adding at least the Arrow 3 since they performed the Dinky Shuttle. They may be able to include the Silverliner 4 with it, but because of its differences, I'm not sure that they'd be able to do it. The Silverliner 5 should most likely be a layer or a loco DLC. When it comes to the ALP 45 DP, I think that they should not include it on this route since it is relatively uncommon on the NEC. They are more commonly seen on the North Jersey coastline. If Dovetail Games ever did another New Jersey transit route that had the ALP 45 running on it, they could most definitely layer it onto this route. When it comes to the GP15D, this would most likely be better off as a loco DLC. Finally, in terms of the CSX locos, I think it could be rather a layer from Sandpatch Grade, AI trains, or Dovetail goes out of their way to reintroduce the GP40 onto this route. Alright, now to quickly summarize, Dovetail Games needs to include the ACS 64 with long distance rolling stock, the ALP 46, and possibly the ALP 46 with Bombardier multi-levels. For locos that I think should rather be included with the base pack or be a DLC, I would say the Arrow 3, Silverliner 4, Acela, and CSX locos. For locos I think should just be a DLC from another route, I would include the ALP 45 DP, Comet Coaches, Silverliner 5, and the GP15D. Now, the reason I talk about this is because there's no way Dovetail Games would be able to include all these trains in a base pack. It would take way too much time. That's why I wanted to condense all these trains into a list that is to see what is most important. Now let's talk about the overall service count that I could expect to see on this route. Adding up all mainline services performed by passenger trains, there would be a total of 417 mainline passenger services. Adding depot moves, deadheads, switching, and freight services, I could honestly see up to 600 to 750 playable services on this route. This route easily has the potential of being one of the busiest routes within Train Sim World 2. Although it would be nowhere as much as a route like Brighton Mainline, it will still have a really good service count for endless hours of fun on the busiest passenger corridor in the nation. "2019 is probably the busiest time period on this route, which is why I think it is the best time period to do. But what other viable time periods are there that could possibly work as a classic timetable pack similar to Diesel Legends of Great Western? There are a lot of different time periods that could work. You could go back to between the 30s and early 60s when most services were operated by the famous GG1s and MP54s under the Pennsylvania Railroad. You could have a time period between the 60s and 70s when Pennsylvania Railroad joined the merge with Penn Central, along with the addition of the Pioneer 3 EMUs. You could go back to between the 70s and 90s when Amtrak operated Metroliners, E60s, and AEM7s, or you could go back as little as 2005. For the sake of this video not being over an hour long, although it probably already is over an hour, I will be focusing mostly on 2005. This was a transitional period for most operators running on the route. Amtrak had just retired their E60s and was nearing completion of the retirement of the Metroliners. New Jersey Transit during this time had also been beginning to modernize its fleet with the introduction of the ALP-46 and soon the Bombardier multi-levels. The ALP-46 would slowly replace New Jersey Transit's ALP-44s. I chose 2005 specifically since New Jersey Transit wouldn't acquire their multi-level coaches until 2006. Since we're on the topic of New Jersey Transit, let's talk about their locomotive fleet on this route. New Jersey Transit during this time used the Aero 3, ALP 44, and ALP 46 with Comet 2 and Comet 4 coaches with a Comet 5 cab car. On extremely rare occasions, Comet 4 cab cars would be in use. The ALP 44 is a 4-axle, 7,000 horsepower, dual cab electric locomotive built by ABB between 1989 and 1997. 33 of these units were built for both New Jersey Transit and SEPTA. It has a top speed of 125 miles an hour, although New Jersey Transit only cleared them to go 100 miles an hour. New Jersey Transit operated 3 different variants. The first 15 are the standard ALP 44s marked as the ALP 44O. 5 additional units were purchased by New Jersey Transit marked as the ALP 44E in 1995. The final 12 locomotives were delivered in 1996, marked as the ALP 44M. These locomotives were fully retired from New Jersey Transit by 2012. The ALP 44 uses a Nathan K5LA and a steel bell. Services would be relatively similar to modern day, although there is a chance that there may be less express trains due to this time period occurring before the Atlantic City Express began service and the Amtrak Clocker service was soon to be discontinued. There are probably less services during this time as well. It is also likely that more Aero 3s were running on this route during this time period, along with some diesel trains. Some diesel trains that you could see on this route are the EMD GP40PH-2 and the PL42AC. However, most traffic is electric trains. Moving on to Amtrak, their locomotive fleet during this time would be very different. For all of Amtrak's long-distance and regional trains, Amtrak used the iconic AAM7 and HHP8. The Acela was also relatively new during this time, entering service between 2000 and 2006. The AM7 is a 4-axle, dual-cab electric locomotive built by EMD between 1978 and 1988. The locomotive has a maximum power output of 7,000 horsepower and a top speed of 125 miles an hour. Amtrak purchased 47 of these units and became a huge success for Amtrak. After Amtrak acquired control of the Northeast Corridor back in the 70s, Amtrak was desperately looking for a new, fast, and reliable electric passenger locomotive, especially after the failure of the E60. Amtrak conducted trials for European-styled electric locomotives on the Northeast Corridor, such as the Swedish RC4 1166 and the French class CC 21000. Amtrak eventually favored the RC4 1166 and became the stepping stone for EMD to build the AEM7. Upon their entering of service, they became a huge hit. This led to all GG1s being retired and a slow fade away of the E60 and the Metroliners. It was stated by many that no locomotive since the New York Central Hudson had such an impact on speeds and schedule performance. It basically saved Amtrak from certain doom, becoming their most successful locomotive without a doubt. The AM7 lived a long and successful career until in 2014 they were fully replaced along with the HHP8s by the ACS 64. In 1999, Amtrak rebuilt 29 of their AM7s into AM7ACs. These rebuilds allowed for improved high-speed tractive effort for longer trains. The AM7 used a Nathan K5LA and a steel bell or E-bell. The AM7 is one of the most iconic electric locomotives that has been highly requested by many players in Train Sim World. It would be amazing to have this icon in Train Sim World. Moving on, the HHP8 is a 4-axle, dual-cab electric locomotive built by Bombardier and Alstom between 1996 and 2000 alongside the Acela Express. Its design was taken directly from the Acela itself, but was changed for the use of a single locomotive. It has a maximum power output of 8,000 horsepower and a top speed of 125 miles an hour. 15 of these units were built for Amtrak. Once electrification was completed between New Haven and Boston, Amtrak was in need of new electric locomotives to supply the newly electrified line. They were unable to order more AEM-7s and they desperately wanted to retire the E60. Amtrak resorted to Bombardier and Alstom to supply this demand and increase train traffic. Upon entering service, they replaced all E60s and supplemented the AEM-7s. However, the HHP-8 never gained the same luck the AEM-7 or Acela had. The HHP-8 suffered from a lot of reliability issues. With the AEM-7s nearing the end of their service life, Amtrak began planning the replacement of both locomotives with the ACS-64. It had a relatively short operation life, only being in service for 14 years. The HHP has relatively similar sounds to the Acela Express, having a hybrid Nathan K5LA and rather a steel bell or an E-bell. Although the HHP was an unreliable locomotive, it is still a favorite amongst rail fans and would be really awesome to see within Trainsim World. In terms of services, they would be for the most part the same. However, there may be less services during this time period. One notable difference, however, with Amtrak during this time period was the operation of their clocker service. This is a passenger service in partnership with New Jersey Transit to provide a faster and more comfortable service compared to standard New Jersey Transit trains, but a slower and more crowded service compared to Amtrak services. 2005 was the final year this service was operational. The clocker made stops at New York Penn, Newark Penn, Metro Park, New Brunswick, Trenton, Cornwallis Heights, North Philadelphia, and Philadelphia 30th Street Station. The service during this time period used an ALP-46 from New Jersey Transit and Ann Fleet 1 coaches from Amtrak. This is a really unique service and would be really cool to see as there is nothing else like this in the nation. Last but not least, we have SEPTA. Not a lot is different about the operator during this time period other than the Silverliner 5 not operating back then. Different locomotives were also used on the limited stop rush hour services during this time. The locomotives used in question were the ALP-44 and the AEM-7. SEPTA owned one ALP-44 and 7 AEM-7s for use on their rush hour services. Other than these minor things, SEPTA doesn't have a whole lot of differences. If Dovetail Games does both the ALP-44 and AEM-7 in this pack, they can most certainly reskin it into the SEPTA livery. SEPTA also operated Silverliner 2s and Silverliner 3s during this time. Freight would be relatively similar on this route, although they would not have any sort of in-cab signaling on board. Speaking of no in-cab signaling, ACSCS was not functional during this time period. It was still being implemented across the Northeast Corridor. The system wasn't fully implemented until 2015. The only safety system present on this route is ATC. Although you still have guidance on speed restrictions for upcoming signals, there is still no sort of enforcement on track limits. Engineers need to be paying close attention to upcoming speed limits to get passengers to their destinations safely. Now, what makes sense with a classic timetable pack like this? The most obvious ones that should be included in this pack are the ALP-44, AEM-7, and HHP-8. If Dovetail Games doesn't end up adding the single level coaches into the modern timetable, this would be a great way to add them. They could then be layered onto the modern timetable. If Dovetail Games did not include the Aero 3 and Silverliner 4s in the modern pack, then this would also be a great time period to add them in. But the ALP-44, AEM-7, and HHP-8 are must for this pack. This is what I think is the best time period to do for a classic timetable pack. Now there are a few other eras that I will briefly go over, but not in a whole lot of detail. The next era that I've chosen is 1985. I chose this time period specifically because both Amtrak and New Jersey Transit owned the E60. Amtrak also still had AM7s back then in their Phase 3 livery. Amtrak also owned its first ever high-speed trains known as Metroliners. Amtrak trains will however need additional rolling stock during this time period, as Amtrak was using various types of older rolling stock ranging from passenger cars to baggage cars. When it comes to New Jersey Transit, they primarily used the Aero 3 on the NEC, while the E60 was used exclusively on the North Jersey coastline. This means the E60 will be running between Penn Station and Broadway. It is also likely diesel trains operated on the NEC during this time, although I was unable to find any sort of documentation confirming it. If they did, they most likely only used the U34CH and F40PH-2 cap. SEPTA would not have any sort of limited stop local haul trains. Everything would be making local stops. SEPTA's rolling stock would be relatively the same during this time. Overall, this would be another interesting classic timetable pack, as it would introduce the E60 into the game, another highly requested electric locomotive. We would also get the Metroliners, whose operations would be significantly different than a train like the Acela. The next time period would be between the 60s and 70s, when Penn Central operated the Northeast Corridor. Penn Central would be using a wide variety of trains during this time period. These include the Aero 1, GG1, Pioneer 3, Silverliner 2, Silverliner 3, and Silverliner 4. Freight was also present during this time. The primary locomotive used for freight was the E44 electric locomotive. This was one of very few electric freight locomotives that operated in the US. GG1s were also used for freight operations. Penn Central also operated diesel freight trains. Although this is personally my least favorite time period, this still has some interesting rolling stock in it, such as the E44 along with all the Silverliner trains. The final time period takes us back to between the 30s and 60s. This was when the Pennsylvania Railroad operated the Northeast Corridor and when electrification was completed between Washington, D.C. and New York City. Not a whole lot of different trains ran along the corridor during this time. Most trains were performed by the MP54 EMUs and GG1. GG1s would be performing both passenger and freight operations on the route. This would be a really interesting time period to see in the game and would be a great opportunity to finally introduce the well-known GG1s. Although it may feel very out of place operating such old locomotives on a shiny new route based in 2019, it would still be a really cool timetable pack to see. To quickly summarize what I want to see, I think Dovetail Games should set the route in 2019 or 2021 post-COVID, and for a classic timetable pack, Dovetail Games should do a 2005 timetable pack so that we can get the AM7, HHP8, ALP44, and older Silverliners. This route is full of history, giving Dovetail Games many different opportunities that can be represented within the game. When it comes to the practicality of this route, this is where it gets into some trouble. There are a couple factors that really hurt the chances of this route coming to Train Sim World. The first factor is the route length. Although 91 miles may not be completely out of Dovetail Games' reach, it still seems relatively ambitious for them to do. If they spend a good amount of time on this route and were willing to do the full 91 miles, then I would rule this out. I want this route to have the best scenery possible and don't want it to feel rushed like routes such as Sherman Hill or Southeastern High Speed. What makes things even more difficult is that it's unable to be shortened to somewhere like Trenton since not all Acelas stop there. Most skip the station. The Acela doesn't make any other stops until it reaches Philadelphia. This is why they need to do the full 90-mile route. The second hurdle is licensing issues with SEPTA. SEPTA has never been in Train Sim World or Train Simulator Classic. This means that they most likely do not have a license with them. Although I wouldn't say that this route wouldn't be ruined without SEPTA, it would still be really nice to have it, as it gives a decent amount of variety by having much more EMU traffic than New Jersey Transit, and it's a relatively requested operator to see within Train Sim World. Other than these two factors, this route is plausible to be added one day in the near future. Hopefully one day Dovetail Games will be able to acquire a SEPTA license to give this route its full glory. Northeast Corridor New York to Philadelphia would make for an amazing addition to Train Sim World 2. It's my personal favorite portion of the entire line and has the potential of being one of the best US routes within the game. The line has various types of electric traffic that isn't seen anywhere else in the nation and is significantly different from NEC Boston to Providence. There would be lots to do on this route, from local CSX freight operations, to short dinky shuttle services, to commuter train action performed by SEPTA and New Jersey Transit, to high-speed action performed by Amtrak, whether done by the ACS-64 or the famed Acela. There is lots to do on this route, giving many hours of fun on America's busiest passenger corridor. This route would make for an amazing addition to Train Sim World 2 if it ever comes to the game in the near future. Thank you for watching, everyone. If you're new to the channel, consider liking the video and subscribing for more Train Sim World 2 content. I hope you all enjoyed, and I will see you all in the next video. This is Crazy Dash. Peace out.